Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back with another episode of Commander Cheapskate Gamer Reviews. And on today's episode, we're taking a look at the brand new Necromunda expansion made by Games Workshop. This book is Necromunda, the Book of the Outcast. This is the latest publication that they have made in their latest batch of updates for Necromunda, and this is actually a really good expansion. And what we're going to be doing on this one today, we'll be doing a little bit more of a deep dive on this product. We'll actually be talking about quite a bit today, so this video is going to be a little bit longer than I usually do when it comes to my Commander Cheapskate reviews. When it comes to Games Workshop products, I'm going to do more like a deep dive like I do for my Warhammer Armies project reviews. So because of that, I will be putting down timestamps down below in the description, so that way you can jump around to the parts of the review that is the most pertinent to you. So things that we'll be talking about today, of course, we'll be talking about the gang composition, the different fighters that this book also has. We'll talk about their affiliation mechanics that they have for their fighters, as well as how you go about building different kind of outcast gangs on this one as well. We'll also be talking about the brand new game mechanic for Delegation Gangs. We'll go a little bit more in depth about that one as well. We'll discuss Archetypes as well as Hanger-Ons and Brutes. We'll talk about terrain, the new expansion they've made on Wyrd Powers. We'll also talk about the brand new Outlanders Campaign game mechanic as well, and how that pretty much works. We'll talk about the no Outcast tactics, the trading posts, and then in the end we'll give you our overall conclusion on this product and whether this is a good buy or not. So for those of you guys who are interested in knowing exactly what the Book of the Outcast contains, go ahead and pay attention on this one, and let's get this video on a roll. Alright, first of all, let's go ahead and talk about gang creation first of all. This is probably the main reason why most people will want to purchase the Book of the Outcast in the first place by Games Workshop. So just to give you guys a little bit of idea about how the gang composition works, it's pretty similar to the other gangs in terms of the number of starting credits that you get and equipment sense for fighters and things of that nature. However though, when you start getting into the actual game mechanics of actually building up your gang, this is where things get a little different. And the reason why the major difference between normal gangs that you create as opposed to an outcast gang depends entirely upon your leader. The outcast leader is perhaps the most important character in the game, in the gang itself, if you're making an outcast gang. And the reason why is because of how important that this character pretty much plays. They pretty much set the tone of what the entire gang is about, as well as what kind of things they'll be taking for the gang, what kind of skills they'll be focusing on, what kind of alliances they can make. So because of that, it's extremely important for you to be kind of careful about how you go picking out your outcast leader as well. So let's go and talk a little bit more when it talks about that person. First of all, when you talk about your outcast leader, this person costs about 125 credits. Now there's a couple of options you can go with. They do give you a series of 4 different stats, very much like a Venator gang, in which you can pick what kind of stat kind of matches the game playing style you want to have for your gang leader. So that's one option that you could actually have. Also, another option that you have as well is that you could actually choose a leader that's has stats already attached to them already. So these are things like members of different guild, criminal, and noble house delegations. You could pick those guys. You could pick different hanger-ons to be your leader if you want to as well. So like you get like a bounty hunter, for example. Or you could actually pick a Dramatis Personae, one of the many special characters that have been created by the Necromunda game system. You could actually use that as a leader for your gang. The only difference, of course, is that that person, you have to pay for their costs right off the bat, and they're elevated to being the new gang leader. So that's the first thing that ends up happening. Another thing you also have to do as well is also pick out their affiliations as well. There's pretty much basically 5 major delegations you can choose from. You can choose either the Outcast delegation, Outcast affiliation, where you could choose your 4 different stats. A clan house, where you basically are like a clan house leader from like a normal gang. You can pick a guild delegation leader, noble delegation leader, criminal delegation leader. It's pretty much up to you how you want to do it. And once you pick that background affiliation, you then have to pick an archetype for your leader as well. And that archetype basically breaks down what kind of skills that you'll have access to as leader. We'll talk about those a little bit more in detail as we go further into the video. So like I said before, the outcast gang leader is perhaps the most important member of the gang, because of the impact that this character actually has for the entirety of the gang as well. So you have to be really careful when you actually pick these guys out to make sure that's the kind of thing you want to focus on for your gang when you actually go about creating it as well. And so because of, there's a huge variety of different gang leaders you can use to make this gang, which in turn of course will also have huge impact on the type of gangs that you have, which is really, really awesome. You're really going to see a lot of diversity coming out of the Book of the Outcast. Now, when the next thing you have, of course, is your Outcast champion. This is like the typical champ that you get for every single one of your guys' gangs, so this one hasn't really changed too much either. Just to give you guys an idea about your Outcast champion, your Outcast champion does cost 60 credits for this character. We'll talk about the stats of the individual fighters later on in another video. I'll do another Way of the Underhigh video for making an Outcast gang, where I'll talk about the actual stats for these guys. But for the most part, just be aware that these guys are pretty much like kit out like basic general gang champions, pretty much for the most part. Now, when it comes to your Outcast champion, your Outcast champion is very similar to your Outcast leader in the sense that you could either choose the Outcast stat line that they actually provide to you in the book, or you can use, if you decide to be a Clan House Outcast gang, you can actually use a gang champion from that one, or you could actually use the champion level fighters from each of the guild, noble, or criminal delegations you have as well. And this will actually be subject to the leader's origin. So whatever the leader actually is for your Outcast leader, that's what's going to pretty much determine what kind of Outcast champion this guy is going to be for the most part. At the same time, your affiliation will also be already chosen too by your Outcast leader, but like I said before, we'll talk a little bit more about affiliations later on down the line. You can, however, choose a totally different archetype for your champion as an opposite of your Outcast leader, so that's one of the things that's nice about this. And another thing that's really nice about this gang as well, you could actually have one Outcast champion for every 3 normal high scum that you have in your gang. So you could actually stack up quite a bit of champions in this gang just right off the bat, just because you can have one for every 3 fighters that you have in this Outcast gang. So it's kind of a nice little option that you have there as well. Puts in a lot of variety of type of things you can build for your gang as well. Now, the next thing, of course, we're going to talk about is your typical Outcast Hive Scum. So these guys cost 30 credits each. They pretty much have the same stat line as the normal Hive Scum that you can hire for Hanger-Ons for your gang, as always. So that's a nice part about that as well. And they're also pretty cheap to equip as well. So because of that, you could actually easily meet that 3-fighter requirement to promote another champion inside your gang as well, which is actually kind of nice. The nice thing about this group too is that the way that the rules are written, unfortunately for a lot of the different gangs that exist in different books that have been published already, they had a real difficult time of differentiating between juvie versus ganger level fighters and gangs. Perfect example could be like, perfect example was the Venator gangs, right? The Venator gangs, we don't know if they have any juvie level fighters. Well, in this book, it's kind of nice. They just tell you right off the bat, this is a combination of both a juvie as well as a ganger class. So if the rules talk about juvies, like for settlements and things, this is what they're referring to. You get Hive Scum instead, which is actually kind of nice. They could also be equipped with some pretty nice variety of different weaponry as well. I think they can go up to rarity level 7, I believe, with the weaponry that they can purchase as well. And you can also have a specialist right off the bat, which is kind of nice. So that way you can equip them with weapons from the trading posts and things of that nature. Unfortunately, when you make your gang right off the bat, you will not be able to equip your specialist with any special weapons at all, because the only have is normal basic weapons and basic equipment available from their rosters, but you can always purchase those from the trading post, which is really, really nice to use in your gangs. So with that being said, that pretty much wraps up the gang composition and just a quick overview of that. Don't worry, we'll do more of a deep dive on these guys when I actually make a Way of the Underhigh video, talking about how you can build your very first Outcast gang, and we'll go a little bit more detail on that video. So with the gang composition over with, let's go and talk about affiliations real fast. Alright, so here it comes when it comes to your affiliations. When it comes to your affiliation, this is kind of important to keep in mind when you build your gang. And the reason why is because your affiliation must be chosen at the time of your gang's creation. So once you create your gang, you have to pick an affiliation of some sort to choose. Now you basically have 5 major affiliations you can choose from. You have Clanless, which is the most common one that most of these gangs will actually use. And we'll talk a little bit more about detail about the pros and cons of having that affiliation. You have the Clan House one, which is really great. So like if you already own a gang of some sort, which is probably the most cost-effective way of playing an Outcast gang. Let's say you already own a gang because you just like playing, for example, House Cawdor. So because you have a House Cawdor gang already, but you want to be able to make it into an Outcast gang. The nice thing about that is that you can still keep your house gang and just make them Outcasts instead. So it's a really nice money-saving way for you to actually participate if you want this. So just because you want to make an Outcast gang, you don't necessarily need to buy new miniatures. You can just use the ones that you already have, which is super nice as well. You can also choose a Merchant Guild affiliation as well. So if you have some Merchant Guild miniatures that are made from Forge World, or maybe you've converted your own, you could use these for an Outcast gang to make what's known as a Delegation Gang, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail here later on in the video. Same thing with criminal organizations and noble houses. You can actually choose those for your affiliations as well, especially if you have miniatures for those already for your delegations. You can use those to make a basis for a Delegation Gang. But we'll talk about those details more in a second. For now, let's go and talk about exactly what you can expect by having these different affiliations and what kind of pros and cons you have for those. So up first, you have the clanless affiliation. So here's some of the things you can do with the clanless affiliation. One of the benefits of being a clanless gang is that you can ignore all law-abiding and outlaw statuses for your gang, which is nice, which means you can purchase things in the black market. You can also still hire hired guns who are both law-abiding and outlawed as well. If you're worried about doing any action that might make you break your law-abiding status or your outlaw status, it doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. That's the nice thing about making a clanless gang. Those kind of labels and status effects will never affect you as well. At the same time, you also don't get any additional options for purchasing weapons and war gear. So long as you meet the rarity requirements and it's on the trading posts of both the black market and the general trading posts, you can purchase it. So there's no restrictions there. There's also no bonuses either, but at the same time allows you a lot more flexibility. Now here's where the drawback comes in with making a clanless gang. If you do make a clanless gang, you cannot make any alliances whatsoever. Merchants, criminal organizations, noble houses, they will not help you out at all. Just because clanless gangs are known for being untrustworthy and backstabbing and, you know, basically being the bottom of the lowest of the low. So because of that, you can't make any alliances. So if you plan on making alliances in the future, this may not be the affiliation you want. But at the same time, though, this is the most flexible of all the different affiliations you can choose. So, you know, choose accordingly for your gang. Now, the next affiliation is the Clan House affiliation, and this one I really like a lot. And the reason why I like this one a lot is because this speaks to the cheapskate in me. Because that way, if you own a house gang of some sort already and you don't want to buy new miniatures to participate as an Outcast gang, you don't have to. And that's the really nice part about this game mechanic, which I really appreciate that Games Workshop actually did. Just because I'm a cheapskate, and the first thing I'm going to ask is, how can I save money if I want to do this? And this is a perfect way to do so. So if you're playing a House Goliath gang, an Escher gang, a Delite gang, any of the 6 major houses, you can still make into an Outcast gang if you want to. Now, with that game mechanic, you still get your normal weapons and war gear associated with your clan. So whatever your rule book is for your individual gang, you can still get access to all those materials, Hanger-Ons, Brutes, all that. Nothing has changed. Now, when it comes to your alliances, however, if you do make an Outcast gang, you can only make an alliance with whatever strong alliances that your house normally has. So, for example, I believe for House Escher, they have an alliance with House Ulanti, as well as the Water Guild, as well as the Coal Traders. So those are the only 3 that can actually make for the strong house alliances. So if you play an Outcast Escher gang, those are the only 3 alliances you can make. You can't make any other alliances beyond those 3 groups, because they already have strong alliances in your house to begin with, and because you might be an Outcast, they're more likely to help you out even though you might be an Outcast, but nobody else will touch you, because otherwise you'd be considered a clanless gang. And so those are some of the benefits and drawbacks of being a clan house Outcast gang. So another affiliation you can choose is a merchant guild, which is absolutely cool. You can choose one of the 6 merchant gangs that exist out there for the guilders. And so the nice thing about that one is you can purchase any weapons and war gear that guild delegation has access to, regardless of the rarity or the legality of those items. So let's say, for example, you're playing an Outcast gang and you want to be in affiliation with the Water Guild, for example. You can purchase needle pistols, needle rifles, that sort of thing, which is actually kind of nice. Or, for example, let's pretend you're associated with the house of the Promethean Guild, right? So because of that, you could actually get access to flamers, photon flash grenades, all that kind of stuff. At the same time, you can also purchase cult icons for your gang for 40 credits, which is really nice as well. Now, let's talk about some of the drawbacks. The major drawback you have if you become a merchant guild Outcast gang is that you can only ally with that chosen guild. So whatever guild you pick, those are the only allies you can take. So for example, if you decide to affiliate yourself with the House of Coin, for example, the Guild of Coin is the only guild you can make alliances with, all right? Or for example, let's say you chose the Slaver Guild, okay, as your affiliation. You can only take Slaver Guild allies. That's the only one you can take from there. So those are some of the benefits and drawbacks of being a merchant guild affiliated gang. Now, for your Outcast gang, you can also choose a criminal organization affiliation, which is kind of nice, which means you can purchase any weapons and war gear that the criminal organization delegation has access to, regardless of the rarity or the legality, which is really nice. So, for example, if you decide to affiliate yourself with the Cold Traders, for example, right off the bat, you can buy Xenos weapons for your gang, which is kind of nice because you automatically get that as well. So that's one of the nice thing about that part, which is really, really cool. At the other hand, though, however, you could also, depending on what kind of faction you can take different kind of weapons they have. At the same time, though, just like with the other ones that we talked about, the only alliance you can make, however, is with the criminal organization that you're related to. So, for example, let's go back to our Cold Trader, for example. So let's say you're a Cold Trader affiliated gang. That means the only criminal organization you can make an alliance with is with the Cold Traders, and they can only send you their shore smuggling party is the only thing you can get. So keep that in mind when it comes to making a criminal organization-based Outcast gang. And lastly, you have your Noble House Outcast gang as well. So let's talk about these guys real quick. So for your Noble House Outcast gangs, you may purchase any weapons and war gear that the Noble House delegation has access to, regardless of its rarity or its legality. So that's actually kind of nice as well. So for example, let's pretend your House Graham, for example, you can purchase, bolt guns, power swords, that kind of stuff, which is actually kind of nice. Combat shotguns, all kinds of different things as well. And just like with the other affiliations that we saw earlier, you can only ally yourself with a Noble House. You can only ally yourself with any Noble House except for your own. There we go, that's the word I'm looking for. The reason why I bring this up, this is a very important thing to remember, because when I actually read that rule, you actually had to reread it a couple of times because the way that it's worded is kind of confusing. So that's the thing you want to keep in mind. So let's say, for example, you're a House Catalyst Outcast gang, okay? That means you can make an alliance with every single other house, but you cannot make an alliance with House Catalyst. Alright, so the idea that you're turning your back on your Noble House, and so because of that, Noble House wants nothing to do with you, which means that the other houses, of course, will use you because Noble Houses are mercurial like that, and they will look for a way to, stick it to the rivals by hiring outcasts from their rivals, but your own house won't do it. So, for example, let's pretend you're a House Ulanti gang, just for another iteration of this. Let's say you're an outcast gang from the Noble House of Ulanti. You cannot take a House Ulanti alliances. You can do anybody else, but you can't do House Ulanti. So, make sure that if you decide to become a Noble House Outcast gang, that you choose the correct house that you want, because just realize that you will not be able to ally yourself with that house, so just keep that in mind when you decide to do this. Now, I know the burning question that a lot of people have, especially when it comes to these affiliations, are delegation gangs, and so we're going to talk about delegation gangs next. Alright, so one of the big ones that people have a lot of questions on are the delegation gangs. Now, the delegation gangs is something that the Games Workshop has been teasing since they've been announcing the Book of the Outcast. And a lot of people have had all kinds of questions about the delegation gang. So let's go ahead and talk about that real quick. So what is a delegation gang? A delegation gang is a gang that uses a delegation of either the guilders, the criminal organizations, or the noble houses to build the core of their gang. Alright, and basically the idea is that if you decide to go with the delegation gang, you start with 1, all the members of that delegation, 2, you start with all the same stats that they have, 3, all the equipment that they automatically come with, and 4, the skills that we have with them as well. So it's kind of a nice way to actually get some really good fighters with some good equipment and good skills right off the bat for your gang. So let's go ahead and talk about that real quick. So when it comes to delegation gangs, your delegation gangs have gang ranks associated to them, as well as costs for your roster, and the Book of the Outcast actually does a really good job of doing this. So let's take the Water Guild for example. So let's pretend you want to make your core of your gang a Water Guild delegation gang. You want to use that. You want to use the Sonatican Siphoning delegation as the core of your gang. Now what they actually do, they actually give you the list of all the fighters as well as what their rank would be inside of your gang and how many of them you get inside of your delegation as well, and how much they would cost for your credits individually as well as totally. Now the reason why they do that is so that way you can put down the cost of them in your gang roster. Now you cannot hire these guys out individually. So let me talk about this for example. So for example, a Sonatican Siphoning delegation will cost you 435 credits out of the 1,000 credits you start off with to build your gang. 185 of those credits will be going to your Master Sonatican, who is going to be the leader of your gang. So that's the gang rank they have, and you can only have this one guy. Your Siphonite, for example, will cost you 90 credits, and he'll be the champion of your gang as well, and you only get one of these guys too. And your Subnauticon will count as a ganger in terms of your gang rank. You get one of these guys, he costs 160 credits. Now the important thing they want to tell you, of course, when it comes to your delegation core, is that you cannot recruit further members in that delegation. So going back to our Nautican Siphoning delegation as our example, you only get one Master Nautican, one Siphonite, one Subnauticon. That's it. It's not like you can purchase multiple Subnauticans for your gang. Unfortunately, I think that'd be actually kind of cool if you could, but unfortunately they won't let you do that. what you have is what you have, and that is it. You cannot get any more members from that guild to make up your gang. You have to spend the rest of your credits on other Outcast members for your gang. So that's what they do as well. Another thing you need to also keep in mind as well is that a lot of the special rules that Delegation Outcast Gangs have, they don't get those Outcast statuses anymore. So for example, when it comes to the Water Guild, let's use the Water Guild as our example once again and talk about those guys. So those guys actually have quite a bit of different special rules attached to them as well. Okay, so not only do they have really good stats for their fighters and things of that nature, which is actually kind of nice, but they also have some extra special rules that they could also use for their gang too. So going back to the Nautican Siphoning Delegation, for example, they lose their Mana Part special rule. They'll lose their Water Harvest special rule. That kind of thing, okay? And the reason why that is the case is the reason why they lose those special rules is to represent the fact that they are now outcasts and they're actually been kicked out of the guild. So because of that, they can't use those special rules for themselves, all right? So that's one of the sad things about an Outcast Delegation game. But it kind of makes sense though, because if these guys were standing members of the guild, they would not be outcasts, you know what I'm saying? And so I can understand why they made that choice when you make these Delegation Gangs as well. Now there's also one more important thing you need to be fully aware of when it comes to making an Outcast Delegation Gang. Outcast Delegation Gangs can't take alliances, period. Okay, so going back to our Water Guild example, let's pretend you take the Nautican Siphoning Delegation as the core of your gang, and you purchase all those guys with all their equipment and everything else like that, and you build your gang off of it. You can't make an alliance of any sort if you decide to take a Delegation Gang. So it's not like you can take another guild alliance to double up. That's not going to happen, right? So you can't double up on the same type of fighters. So keep that in mind when you make an Outcast game, because that's going to be a very, very important thing to keep in mind, especially if you make an Outcast game that uses a delegation of some sort to make the core of your gang. So moving on, let's go and move on and talk about the other parts of the book. Alright, so the next thing we're going to talk about real quick are Archetypes. So Archetypes are pretty important because you use this for your leaders as well as your champions, and these will determine your primary as well as your secondary skills for your leaders as well as your champions as well. And pretty much you got a handful of different archetypes you can choose from. You can either choose the Brawler archetype, the Gunslinger archetype, the Survivor archetype, the Mastermind archetype, and the Wyrd archetype. So let's go and talk about those real quick. So when it comes to the Brawler, for example, your primary skills will be Brawn, Ferocity, as well as Leadership, and then your secondaries will be Agility as well as Combat. If you decide to go with the Gunslinger archetype, your primaries will be Agility, Leadership, as well as Shooting, while as Cunning and Savant will be your secondaries. For a Survivor, your actual primary skills will be Combat as well as Ferocity and Leadership, but Brawn and Agility will be your secondaries. Now moving on to Mastermind, which is actually, I just love the name of that one. Mastermind, for example, you will have Cunning as well as Leadership as your primary, as well as Savant, with Shooting as well as Agility for your secondary. Alright, so that would be how the Mastermind works. And then finally you have your Wyrd one. Your Wyrd one has primarily Leadership for their primary as well as Cunning for their secondary. And the reason why they only have two is because they actually have access to Wyrd Powers as their skills as well. And so because of that, we'll spend a little bit more time talking about those psychic abilities later on for the Wyrd status, because we're going to go into a deep dive because Games Workshop has actually created a lot more information about psychic abilities in Necromunda. And we'll talk about those a little more here in detail later on in the video. Now when it comes to Hanger-Ons and Brutes, for example, they're largely the same as the other gangs, okay? So you have your access to your Sloppers, your Dome Runners, you still have access to your different, ammo jacks, and all kinds of different things as well. Same thing with your Brutes. You can primarily take either Ambots, or you can take on Jotun, H-grade, Servitor Ogrins as your Brutes as well. However, there is actually one Hanger-On that's actually unique to the Outcast gang, and those guys are called Underhive Traders. Now this is a brand new Hanger-On that's been brought in for the Book of the Outcast. It costs 50 credits for these guys. Let's talk about their stats real quick. So they have a movement of 5 inches, 4 weapon skill, 4 ballistic skill, 3 strength and toughness, 1 wound. They have 4 initiative, 1 attack, 8 leadership, 7 cool, 7 willpower, and 7 intelligence. And what these guys have is that these guys have a couple of special rules attached to them. First of all, they have the finest merchandise special rule, which means they can make purchasing actions as if they're a member of a gang, as if they were the leader. So for example, if you want to use your leader for something else, or if your leader gets taken out of action, no biggie, your Underhive Trader can still trade with those guys. Now when it comes to your trader, you actually have 4 different specialist products that they can actually deal in, and that gives you different various bonuses associated with that. So for example, if you take a Relic Monger, for example, what this guy does, he actually carries like trinkets and things that can heal your guys. So he acts kind of like a slopper. And if you roll a d6 for each of your guys who are seriously injured, on a 6 they automatically ignore the result, so that's kind of neat. You have what's known as a Beast Wrangler, and a Beast Wrangler could actually give you 1 experience point for each of your exotic beasts in your gang throughout the campaign, so that's kind of nice. You have your Gunsmith, Gunsmith. The Gunsmith is probably the most useful one in my opinion for this one as well. This guy could actually have your weapons turned into mastercrafted weapons with no extra cost, so this guy is actually kind of nice. You can do it once per post-battle sequence for your weapons. You have a connected trader, which basically means that this guy could actually help you double the amount of money that you sell for your items in your stash, so that's really cool as well. And based on which kind of product specialist you take, they got different equipment and stats. For example, Relic Mongers have Mauls, and they also have the Fearsome skill. Beast Wranglers are equipped with Last Pistols, and they have the Overseer skill. Gunsmiths have Bolt Pistols, Stub Guns, as well as shotguns, and they have the Marksman skill. Connected traders have a Mastercrafted Last Gun, they have the Savvy Trader skill. So based on how you want to equip this guy, what kind of role you want him to play for your gang, he's actually quite flexible and actually pretty neat. And the best thing about this guy, he can actually be taken by any gang. It's not just for any Outcast gangs only, it's any gang that you want. So if trading is a big thing for you, or you struggle with trading, this might be the Hanger-On for you. Now, let's go and talk about terrain real quick. So terrain does play a larger role in the Book of the Outcast, especially if you're talking about your Outlander campaigns, okay? So for example, those gang strongholds that they've been really pushing a lot on their websites, those are going to be especially useful for you, especially in your Outlander campaign. They actually have rules and things for walls and gates and watchtowers, gunk tanks, as well as looting your gang strongholds. So that's something you want to keep in mind. Me personally, I don't really care about buying the gang stronghold because I don't buy terrain. That's just something I don't do. My gaming group and I, we have a ton of terrain, so we will never have to buy gang strongholds. We can just make one out of the terrain pieces that we have. So that's the nice part about my channel. But for those of you guys who want to purchase a gang stronghold, just realize it's also kind of important to have that in your campaign, and you might want to pay a little bit more attention to that with the terrain rules, especially what kind of role they play in individual scenarios. So that's one thing that this book actually does. So now that we're done talking about terrain, let's talk about Wyrd Powers. Alright, so one of the first things that they have here, of course, is they've actually gone pretty in depth when it comes to Wyrd Powers on this one, okay? So let's go and talk about that real quick. So they've actually make a bunch of different disciplines when it comes to the Wyrd Powers. You have different types of disciplines. Each of the disciplines have different abilities associated to them. And in my opinion, each of the disciplines also have special abilities that they give to your psykers as well. These special abilities are very much like the lore attributes from Warhammer Fantasy Magic. So like if you guys ever played Warhammer Fantasy Magic, you know you have your lores, but the lores give you additional bonuses depending on what lore you use. They have the same kind of thing with Wyrd Powers. However, you only get this special ability if your psyker uses this one single discipline exclusively. So let's give you an example of that. So for example, one of the big new ones that they have is what's known as the Biomancy discipline. And for the Biomancer special ability, if you decide to use this one, you basically gain what's known as the Fast Healing special rule. And what that says is that basically when this fighter makes a recovery test, roll an extra injury die and then choose one to discard. Okay, really, really nice, especially if you want this one. And of course, they have 6 different psychic powers under the Biomancy discipline, for example. Now, just to give you guys an overview, I'm not going to go through each one of the different abilities just because we'll be here for hours if we do that. But just to give you guys an idea, I'm just going to give you a real quick overview exactly what these weird disciplines do. So Biomancy, for example, are good for injuries as well as healing, for example. So I'll just give you an example of their powers. One of them is called Stop Bleeding. It's a basic action. And basically you choose a friendly fighter that suffered at least one flesh wound that's within 18 inches and line of sight of this fighter. That fighter that has a flesh wound immediately removes any flesh wounds they currently have. So that's an example of the Biomancy discipline. Really, really good for injuries as well as healing up your fighters as well. Another discipline that we have, of course, is what's known as Chronomancy, which is basically good for multiple activations. It's also really good for nerfing your enemies who are trying to attack you as well. For example, their special ability is called Flicker, and it says once per battle, this fighter may perform one additional action during their activation to represent the fact that you're actually manipulating time and space on the battlefield in a really limited way, which is actually kind of nice. Really, really good for nerfing your enemies' attacks and giving them minuses to hit and penalties for their attacks and things of that nature. Now, Denovation is also another really good one too. Denovation's special ability was called Diviner. It's called Future Sight. And it says once per battle, the fighter may use this ability to reroll any dice roll made during their activation. This ability may be used to reroll any number of dice. It may even be used to roll made by an enemy fighter. So really, really nice at that. It's really good for making rerolls, is what this weird discipline really is focused on as well. So there's like a whole slew of powers given for that one. For example, one of them is called Forewarning, for example, is one of their powers. It's a basic action. It says, until the end of this turn, the first time this fighter is hit by an attack, roll a d6. On a 2+, that hit is ignored, for example. So kind of neat. They really fleshed out the Wyrd Power disciplines. And like I mentioned before in my Way of the Underhand videos, weird abilities and psychic abilities are becoming more prevalent in the books as time goes on, and especially with this book, psychers are going to be really competitive in Necromunda, and you're going to be seeing a lot more of these guys pop up. So knowing their abilities, knowing their powers, very important. And of course, you have another one called Pyromancy, for example. Pyromancy is a purely offensive discipline, purely focused on long-range attacks with shooting attacks with psychic abilities. Their special ability is called Fire Shield. The fighter cannot be set on fire and is immune to a blaze condition, for example. They also have what's called a Flame Blast, and it says, while this Wyrd Powers maintain one weapon, the melee or versatile trait carried by this fighter gains the blazing trait. They have Molten Bolt, Scouring, all kinds of different stuff they could use, which is really cool. And they also have another new one called Technomancy, which is really good. Technomancy is actually kind of neat. It's got an ability called Techno Affinity, which means that this fighter may reroll any ammo checks they're required to make as well. At the same time, a lot of their weapons, for example, a lot of their spells for their psychic ability is really good for buffing weapons, buffing armor, and also on battlefields that use Zone Mortalis terrain. Just to give you guys an idea exactly what this looks like, for example, one of them is actually called Manipulate Lumens, which basically means the pitch black rules immediately come into effect, or immediately end if they were already in effect, for example. So really good environmental stuff. Manipulate Door is another spell that they have. Crack Lock, another one that they have as well. Overcharge, which makes your weapon stronger. So I think the Technomancy one's going to be really useful to use for a gang. So far, that's my favorite discipline that I like, so I might be using that for my gang later on if I decide to take a psyker in my gang. Now the other two ones, of course, are called Telekinesis and Telepathy, and these two ones we are very intimately familiar with for Necromunda players. And just because the Telekinesis and Telepathy disciplines are what the Wyrd Powers originally have been for the longest time since Necromunda has been released. So we've seen these powers. There's nothing really all that different from what they have originally. Now they do have some new rules, and we'll talk about that, for example. Telekinesis, for example, their special discipline is called Fist of Fury, which means that this fighter makes an unarmed attack, increase both the strength and the damage characteristic of the attack by 1, for example. Most of the abilities are exactly the same that we've seen before, except one of them, for example, they have like 2 new abilities. One's called Hailstorm, for example. It's a basic attack, and basically what it ends up is immediately make a roll against every fighter, friend or foe, that's within 12 inches of this fighter, using this fighter's Ballista skill. Each hit scored is result at Strength 1, Damage 1, AP 0. So, you know, not as powerful as it usually is, but that's because that's where these powers have gone into. Telepathy, another one that we're really familiar with as well. Their special ability is called Fearful Aura, which is nice. It says if an enemy makes a charge action against them in close combat attacks this fighter, they must make a willpower test before moving. If the attack has failed, they cannot move their action immediately. So that is a nice little ability that you get for your telepaths, for those who have that. But for example, like most of the spells that they have are pretty much the same that we've seen before. One of them is kind of nice, is like called Unbreakable Will, for example. It's a basic action with a continuous effect. For this one, it says whenever a friendly fighter takes a nerve test or makes a willpower check while within 9 inches of this fighter, they may use this fighter's cool or willpower characteristics on their own. So that's another example of what we're seeing here. And like I said before in the previous slide, Wyrd Powers, psychic abilities, they're becoming more prevalent in games of Necromunda as time goes on. And it's nice that they actually flesh this up because it gives you a much larger variety of different things you can use for your psychers. And that's actually really cool. And that's one of the things I like about it a lot. So with the psychic abilities over with, let's go ahead and talk about settlements as well as the Outlander campaign. Sorry guys, I was going to talk about this, but Preston Garvey showed up. There's another settlement that needs our help, so I got to end this video prematurely to take care of that. I'm messing. So yeah, I decided to go with Preston Garvey because when you hear about the settlement rules, this is the first thing I thought of was Preston Garvey from Fallout 4 telling us that settlements need help. So the Outlander campaign, let's go and talk about that real quick. So when it comes to the Outlander campaign, just like with other campaigns, it's mostly the same as every other campaign system for Necromunda. You have 3 phases, for example, same stats for experience, same experience table, same skill table, so nothing has really changed there. Same injury table, all that's pretty much the same for the most part. However, the goal though for this settlement though is to make the most impressive settlement is what the goal of this Outlander campaign is. The idea of the Outlander campaign is that you are actually operating in the fringes of Necromunda and that your goal is to build a settlement of your own to build and to run like your own little hideaway away from the hive. That's pretty much how it works. And that's what the whole point of this is. The idea is supposed to be that you're building your own little community out in the bad zones of Necromunda away from law and order. And that's pretty much what you're trying to do for the most part as well. So let's go and talk about exactly what that entails, building up your own settlements. So the first thing you got to do when you actually build your settlement, you have to actually pick a location to start your settlement on. And there's a couple of places you can choose from. One's called a Factorium Runoff, another one's called a Boneyard, another one's called a Ghost Town, another one's called the Depths. You can also set it on the edge of the hive near the Ash Waste. It's entirely up to you. Now, the reason why they have 5 of these is because all 5 of these different locations have various stats associated with them. We have 3 stats for these starting locations. We have defense, resources, as well as toxicity as well. And what ends up happening is that those will actually play a role later on about how big or how complex your settlement can actually be. We could talk about the individual ones if we wanted to, but like I said before, we'll be here for hours if we do that. But needless to say, though, just giving you a brief overview of pretty much how it works. All right. At the same time, the goal of you for the same time as a player is to acquire materials. The reason why you want to acquire materials is because these materials will be used to build up your settlement and to make it more impressive and also to help out your gang a lot. In fact, you could actually spend an entire whole campaign, basically the first half of the campaign is just built specifically to getting materials to build up your stuff. So a lot of Fallout 4 players as well as Minecraft players, you know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to getting resources and materials to build up your settlement. So your materials basically come into 3 flavors. You have what's known as powers, sustenance, as well as salvage. And these materials are harvested during different scenarios that are played in an Outlander campaign, and those materials are used to build structures as well as defenses for your settlement. And we're going to talk about a little bit more exactly what those include here on the next slide. So the reason why we're also talking about the locations are really important. Your locations also important because they have different levels of defense, resources, and toxicity, and those actually have an impact on how big or how complex your structure can be for your settlement. For example, a settlement may not have more defensive structures than its location's defensive rating, for example. So like a Factorium Runoff, for example, will have a number associated with its defense structures. You can't build any more defense structures than that, for example. That's just like the other one. A settlement may not have more building structures than its toxicity rating. So for example, I believe it's the Boneyard, I believe, has the highest toxicity rating, which means they have a toxicity of 2, which means you can only build 2 buildings max in that settlement. So that's one thing you got to worry about as well. Another thing I worry about is that a settlement may not have more supply structures than its resource rating. So some of these resource places have very low resources or some high resources. And so because that building supply structures up at your gang, you can only build so many of those to represent your resource rating. So picking out your location to build your settlement is very, very, very important. In fact, actually something you could actually do if you want to as an arbitrator. This is what I'm going to do for my Outcast, for my Outlanders campaign. I'm going to have my gangs actually fight it out amongst themselves to figure out which of them is going to have a different settlement to choose from, just to create that, you know, that anticipation, that antagonism, which would be actually kind of cool. So that way they have to fight in order to get their settlement, you know, right off the bat. So things of that nature. So going on with the campaign, of course, the campaign has 3 different phases, like I said. We have a development phase, what is known as, and this is actually the first half of the campaign where you build up your settlement by going out and getting resources to create your settlement. These are where you will primarily play the different scenarios, the Outlander scenarios that have been created for this campaign setting to build those resources. That way you can build and develop your settlement. So that's what you're probably doing for the first half of the campaign. Now, of course, you have down phase, and we all know about this phase. This phase is exactly the same as the other ones in previous campaigns, so that part's kind of interesting. And then lastly, we have the expansion phase, and this is where this one, they say, according to the rules I'm seeing here, this is where you're actually doing raids on each other's settlements at this point. You're actually fighting each other at each other's settlements and trying to loot each other's stuff and their resources. And this is where it gets kind of like to the bone at this point. Guys are just fighting it out for the most part, which is actually really cool. And the reason why this whole campaign system is developed is to build structures and buildings. And they actually they have a lot to offer with different benefits and building costs and requirements for different things in your gang. Some require you to build other structures first before you can build certain structures, while other ones will have to have you have like a certain hanger-on in order to build that structure. So let's give you some examples of what we're talking about here, for example. So for example, going into the whole structures, you need to have a dock clinic, for example, okay? So the dock clinic is a building. The benefit for this building is that in the post-game sequence, remove up to 3 fighters from recovery, which is going to be really, really helpful for your gangs, right? However, to build this building, though, you need 20 power, you need 10 substance, as well as 10 salvage to build the structure, and you also need to have a rogue dock hanger-on in order to build this up, for example, okay? Another one you have what's called a bullet hull, for example. A bullet hull will let you add a hired gun to the gang free of charge. It's going to cost you 15 sentence and 10 salvage to build this building. However, you need to make a drinking hole first in order to build that building, okay? To make a drinking hole, however, you need to have a have building first, for example. A have building, for example, increases the settlement's building structure limit by 1. It costs you 10 power, 20 substance, 10 salvage. So you can see here, when you look at these rules and you look at the buildings and the things that it supplies you, it very much has a Fallout 4 settlement build vibe to it. very much a Minecraft vibe as well, which is really, really cool. So if you're really into settlement building, this is going to be really awesome. It kind of reminds me of the camp building system that you'd use in Mordheim, where your camp would give you all kinds of different benefits as so long as you've got the materials to build those items. And this part is really, really cool as well. For example, another one you have is what's called a critter farm, for example. Critter farm will give you 15 units of sustenance, for example. It costs you 5 substance to build this, as well as critters, which is a defensive aspect as well. For example, critters, which are defense, attackers subject to the horrors of the dark special rule when they come attack you, for example. So all kinds of different things. It's really, really cool in this one. And so because of that, the Outcast campaign system is very, very different than what we've seen up to this point. Before, with a campaign system, you're trying to seize territories, build reputation, that sort of thing. And this one, though, you're out there scavenging for resources, which is really, really cool. So really, really neat campaign, and can't really get ready to sink my teeth into that one. Alright, so the last thing we're going to talk about real quick are Outcast scenarios as well as Outcast tactics. Outcast scenarios are really, really important for you to play because this helps you gather materials up for your settlements for the most part, alright? And that's the reason why you want to do them. For example, one of them is called a settlement raid, for example, and basically you're attacking another settlement or a gang settlement and trying to loot it, for example. And one of the things that you get for the reward, for example, is that you get D6 power or D6 salvage or D6 substance, for example, in that campaign if you decide to fight that scenario. For example, another one's called Market Mayhem, for example. Same thing. You actually, for this one though, if you're victorious in this one, you get D6 power, D6 salvage, and D6 sustenance. So you can see exactly how these scenarios are really important for you to play it, so that way you can get the materials you need in order to build up your settlement for the most part. And there's a bunch of different scenarios that they actually give you to try it out, so you can just do that for your game and make it really awesome as well. Now, just like with all the other books, of course, you do have Outcast tactics, for example, and these are actually quite nice. You do have a D66 table that you roll off on, for example, in order to do this, to use these tactics. For example, one of them is called a Few Friends, what it's called, and you can play this game tactic at the start of the battle after both sides are deployed before the first round, for example. And it says your gang may immediately recruit and place in your deployment zone D3+2 Hive Scum hired guns. These fighters are recruited for free and will leave your gang at the end of the battle. These fighters are not counted towards your maximum crew size. If you do not have models available to represent these Hive Scum, you may discard this game tactic and select another. So that's an example of one of the ones that you have there that you could use, for example, for one of your gang tactics. You have another one called Dirty Tactics, which says immediately activate another ready fighter anywhere on the battlefield. So that's kind of nice. You do have some new, unique gang tactics that you have for the Outcast as well, which is really awesome. Now, when it comes to the training post is the same as always. There's not much really different there. The biggest difference, however, probably for this one is what's known as force weapons. So these are actually weapons that you can actually make just like in 40k. So let's talk about that real quick. So a force weapon is any melee weapon that can be made into a force weapon. All you have to do is purchase a psi amplifier from the market from the trading post, and then you do what's known as a psi attunement to it in the post-battle actions phase, and that'll change your weapon, which means that if your weapon is being carried by a psyker and it's got a force weapon, it automatically gains the power as well as a sever trait. So those are some things you can keep in mind when it comes to this gang. So for example, if you decide to use the Wyrd attribute, the Wyrd archetype for your leader, for example, they can equip themselves with a force weapon. So that part's actually kind of neat as well. So like I said, psychic abilities, psychers, force weapons, a huge new game mechanic that's being introduced in this edition of the rules for the Book of the Outcast. So now that we're done talking about our trading post, let's give you our overall conclusion on this product. So in conclusion, this is an excellent buy. It's well worth the cost of actually getting this product, and the reason why is because all the stuff that's in this book, it's got quite a bit in it, and it's actually bringing a lot to your campaigns in Necromunda, so I highly recommend getting this especially. And because of this new book, expect an even crazier diversity of gangs now. So not only do we have the 6 core gangs that we have gangs now that have a delegation allies with criminal guild as well as noble house alliances. We have enforcer gangs now. We have corpse grinder gangs, redemptionist gangs. We're getting these new gangs now, and now this book gives you potentially up to 4 new types of gangs as well, based on delegation gangs and outcast gangs and different archetypes and leaders. It's really, really nice. It adds a lot of diversity to this gaming system. So when you go to playing campaigns now, you don't know what you're going to face anymore, which is actually kind of nice because it actually makes it just wild to see exactly what you can do in these gaming systems, for example. And while Outcasts are definitely a new wildcard addition to any campaign, and I can't wait to see what people are going to do with this, for example. Can you imagine how crazy it's going to be? For example, you might have a delegation gang that's actually based with Slaver from the Slaver Guild, for example, right? So that's their core operator fighters. They have outcasts in that gang as well, and the leader might be, the Chain Lord might be a psychic ability wielding guy who actually uses, like, know, pyromancy and blows you and sets you up on fire. I mean, all kinds of crazy combinations you'll see. You might see counter gangs out there who have actually outcast counter gangs that actually have psychic abilities, because maybe that's why they're outcast, because their leaders are psychers. I don't know. You got all kinds of crazy stuff you could actually do with this as well. At the same time, these Outlander scenario as well as the Outlander campaign is a very cool, it reminds me a lot of Fallout 4 Minecraft. That's what it really reminds me of. It's like something from that. That campaign system is very much dedicated to building up your settlements. It's just really cool, and I can't wait to try it out, because I just can imagine, you know, you're just sitting out there building resources to build your settlement, have to fight off raiders, have to fight off rival gangs. You're just trying to survive, and you got to build your settlement and fight people at the same time. And at the same time, another guy named Preston Garvey shows up and says, "Hey, look, and someone needs your help," for example. And yes, actually, I'm planning on making an Outcast gang, and one of my champions is going to be named Preston Garvey for that reason. Because I'm a huge game nerd that way. So that part's really nice as well. And yes, I will be making a Way of the Underhigh video for making an Outcast gang later on. So for example, if you want to make an Outcast gang for yourself, I will give you some hints, tips, and tricks to make that gang as well, and that'll be coming down later on the pike as well. So that's good for this one, you guys. Like I said, this one's a little bit more of a deeper dive than I usually do when it comes to these Necromunda products, but it's well worth it. There's a lot of new information on here. Really, really awesome. So that's good for those of you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest, greatest hot news related to this channel. That's good for this one, you guys. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.